The hills of Kentucky in 1907 carried a kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, stretched across the woods like a curtain that kept secrets hidden under its folds. The land here was thick with oak and sycamore, the kind of forest where the trees grew so close together their shadows tangled. Hunters often said the woods looked different once you stepped inside them, as if you were walking into a place that wanted you to lose yourself. The town nearby was small, made up of wooden homes with smoke climbing steadily from chimneys, and people who kept to themselves more than most. On the surface, life seemed steady, the kind of life where families worked hard, prayed harder, and carried their sins quietly. The hunting season brought men together from farms, cabins, and even neighboring towns. They carried rifles over their shoulders and knives tied to their belts. And for them, the woods were a test of skill, manhood, and survival. They chased deer and wild hogs, sometimes even black bears if they were lucky. It wasn't just for sport, it was for food, for pride, and for the stories they would tell by firelight. Yet beneath the laughter and bravado, there was always the unspoken rule. You did not wander too deep. The forest had a line. Cross it, and you might not find your way back. Not everyone feared that line. Two brothers seemed to belong to the woods more than to the town. They lived on the edge of the tree line, in a house that looked more like it was swallowed by earth and built upon it. People rarely saw them in daylight, and when they did, they noticed something hard in their eyes, as if the forest had stripped away the softness that lived in other men. They were not poor, not in the way some families struggled. Their land fed them, their traps gave them fur, and their hands were skilled with blade and rifle. But there was an edge to them, something about their stillness, their quiet way of watching others as if weighing them. That unsettled people without a word spoken in town, life rolled on as though untouched. The church bells rang every Sunday morning, pulling farmers and wives and children into the wooden pews. The general store buzzed with the smell of flour, tobacco, and kerosene, a place where gossip slipped through lips as easily as coins slid across the counter. Yet, the brothers rarely stepped inside, and when they did, it was as though the air thickened. People pretended not to notice, but eyes followed them, half curious, half afraid. Among the hunters, their names were spoken in low voices. Some called them skilled woodsmen, others whispered darker things, that they knew the woods too well, that the forest bent itself to them. A few joked they could track a man better than a hound could track a rabbit. Jokes like that never lasted long. The punchlines seemed to weigh too much. Families living near the brothers' land carried unease in their hearts, though none said it out loud. A missing hog, a dog that wandered too far into the woods and didn't return, the sounds of cries echoing faintly at night. These things slipped into conversations only when the sky was black and only to those they trusted. Yet life in Kentucky was hard, and people knew better than to stir trouble. Survival meant silence sometimes. The brothers themselves seemed ordinary and routine. They cut wood, set traps, and skinned hides. The smoke from their chimney curled into the sky just like every other home. Yet there was something wrong beneath the surface, something like a sickness that didn't show on the skin but lived in the mind. The way they spoke to each other was sharp, clipped, as though words were only tools to keep the other in line. They shared everything, meals, work, silence. But the bond felt twisted, a closeness that was both unbreakable and suffocating. The kind where no one else could ever belong. It was the year when whispers grew louder. Hunters vanished deeper in the forest than they should have, and some never returned. At first, people blamed the woods. They said men got lost, rivers swallowed them, animals tore them apart. But soon the excuses thinned. Men who knew the woods like the lines of their palms couldn't just vanish without a trace. The stories became sharper, more fearful. People began to notice the timing, the way the brothers were seen near the edge of the forest on days when someone disappeared. They said the hunters were not the ones doing the hunting anymore. Still, no one spoke too loudly. In small towns, suspicion was dangerous. If you pointed too firm a finger, you had to be ready to face what came back at you. So, The town carried its fear like a weight, hidden under prayer and chores and the endless labor of survival. Yet the silence, it was only the surface. Beneath it, tension coiled, waiting. The world of Kentucky in 1907 seemed steady, but it was a fragile steadiness, like ice thin over a dark pond. Every step carried the risk of breaking through. The brothers stood at the center of it, shadows moving among shadows, and though no one dared say it aloud, there was a sense that something unnatural was about to rise from the forest. Something no prayer could keep away. The first signs of unease didn't arrive with thunder. They came like whispers carried on the wind, easy to ignore at first. A hunter failed to return one evening, and people said he must have wandered too far, or perhaps a storm rolled in and confused his tracks. Then another man disappeared weeks later, one who had grown up in those very woods. The excuses began to falter, but no one dared to name what their hearts already knew. In the town, voices grew sharper in the general store, where men gathered with tobacco-stained fingers and women lingered at the back, pretending to browse. Rumors took shape like smoke, hard to hold but impossible not to breathe in. Some swore the brothers were behind it. Others scoffed, saying no man would be so bold as to strike down hunters armed with rifles. Still, when the brothers passed through, the talk would die at once, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any words. The hunters themselves grew restless. They noticed traps set in strange places, bait left out that wasn't meant for deer or hogs. Some swore they felt eyes on them, watching from behind the trees. A few said they found boot prints too deep in the mud, almost as if someone had been circling them. Hunting, which once was a proud and steady tradition, began to feel like stepping into a game where the rules had changed. No man wanted to admit it aloud, but each carried the gnawing thought. What if he was not the hunter anymore? The brothers moved through all of this as if untouched. They kept to their land, worked their traps, and yet there was something in their manner that had shifted. The older brother grew more controlling, snapping orders at the younger, correcting him over things that didn't matter. How to skin a rabbit, how to stack wood, how to sharpen a knife. The younger brother, though obedient, carried a quiet anger in his eyes, a heat that seemed to grow each time he was corrected. Their bond remained tight, but it was tightening into something more dangerous, as though pressure itself was warping it night. Their voices carried faintly through the woods. Neighbors who lived close enough to hear described the arguments, short, hard bursts of shouting, then silence that lasted too long. Some claimed they heard laughter, but it was not the kind of laughter that belonged to joy. It was sharp, jagged, the kind that could cut if you stood too close. The outside world pressed down harder as the season shifted. That year, the harvest had been poor. Corn withered, hogs died of sickness, and prices at the general store crept higher. Families tightened their belts. Children went to bed with less in their bellies, and men turned to the woods with even greater desperation. The brothers, however, never seemed to struggle. Their traps always bore results. Their table always had meat. People noticed this with suspicion. Some said they had learned secret tricks of the land. Others whispered darker reasons. It did not help that the younger brother began to show off small luxuries. An extra piece of tobacco, a new knife, small things no one could quite explain. The tension thickened when one man returned from the woods pale as death, his rifle missing and his eyes hollow. He would not speak of what happened, only that he had stumbled upon something wrong. He packed his family and left town with 10 days, abandoning his farm. His silence was louder than any story, and it fueled the whispers that were already spreading. The brothers, meanwhile, grew bolder. They began lingering near groups of hunters, watching them from a distance without hiding the fact. Their presence made men uneasy. There was something in the way they stood together, silent, side by side, as if they were measuring the hunters, deciding who was worthy of being prey. Old stories began to surface, dragged from memory by fear. People remembered the boys' childhood, the way they never seemed to mix with other children. They remembered how their father had been a hard man, brutal with his fists, and how their mother had disappeared one winter, leaving no trace but a broken doorframe and blood in the snow. No one ever proved what happened, but the brothers never spoke her name again. These buried stories came alive again, painting the brothers in a darker light, as if their lives had always been tangled with violence. The younger brother carried that violence differently. He began to change in ways the town noticed. He spoke less when he came into town, but his eyes lingered longer on people, scanning them as if peeling back layers. Some said he became reckless, venturing into the woods alone at night. Others claimed he was seen sharpening his knife until sparks flew, long after the sun had gone down. The older brother, for his part, grew colder, more withdrawn, as if his mind lived in a place no one else could reach. Together, they became something more than unsettling. They became a presence, a weight that hung over every hunter who entered the woods. Stories began to circulate that men heard footsteps following them in the forest, close enough to hear twigs snapping. But when they turned, no one was there. Some claimed to find markings on trees, strange carvings, symbols no one understood. Others whispered about finding bones buried shallow in the earth, picked clean in ways no animal would do. What frightened people most was not proof, but the lack of it. The hunters who disappeared left little behind. No blood, no tracks, nothing but silence. It was as if the forest itself swallowed them. And always, the brothers remained, untouched, their lives steady while others unraveled. Inside their home, things were no calmer. The brothers' dependence on each other had twisted into something closer to possession. The older brother demanded loyalty, complete and unquestioning. The younger, though bound by blood, began to feel the weight of chains he could not see. His anger grew sharper, his thoughts darker. He wanted freedom, yet he also wanted the power his brother carried. Their bond, once their strength, had become a storm waiting to break. The town itself was changing under the weight of fear. Families locked their doors earlier. Men carried extra weapons into the woods, their laughter thinner around the campfires. Even the church, once a place of comfort, seemed filled with unease. The pastor spoke of sin, of men who turned their faces from God, and though he never named names, everyone knew who sat heavy in their minds that by late summer, the balance tipped further. A group of young hunters went into the woods together, and only 3 returned, their faces white, their eyes refusing to meet anyone's. They would not speak of what happened, only that they would never step into the forest again. Whispers followed them everywhere, but they held their silence, too broken to share what they had seen. The hunters left behind did not vanish all at once. They simply unraveled, piece by piece, until they were gone. The fear became anger. Some men spoke openly about confronting the brothers, demanding answers. Yet no one dared to act, for each man knew the risk. The brothers had grown too close, too dangerous, and the woods themselves seemed to shield them. To accuse them was to step into a trap you could not escape. Still, tension has a way of finding release, and the air in Kentucky was too thick to hold it forever. The brothers' strange dominance over the land, their unsettling bond, and the vanishing hunters were threads twisting tighter and tighter. No one knew when it would snap, but everyone could feel it coming. Each day was heavier than the last, and the sense grew stronger that the forest was no longer just a place of survival. It was a hunting ground, and not for deer or bear. It was for men. And the hunters were already caught in the game. The night the forest claimed its loudest secret began like many others, quiet, heavy, with the air pressing down as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. A group of hunters, 6 men in all, set out before dusk, rifles slung across their backs, lanterns glowing faintly in their hands. They had heard the whispers, of course, the warnings that hung in every kitchen and storehouse, but fear only sharpened their pride. These men weren't boys. They knew the woods. They had tracked deer through storms, faced bears with nothing but a knife, and returned home to boast by firelight. Yet as they crossed the line of trees, something shifted. The forest seemed to swallow their voices whole. Every laugh and word muffled into silence. The brothers had been waiting. From the shadows of their hidden paths, they watched the hunters move deeper, their lanterns bobbing like small stars in the dark. The older brother's jaw was set hard, his eyes fixed with a cold purpose. He had planned this moment carefully, down to the very spot where the ground dipped and the trees pressed, so close a man could not raise his rifle without branches clawing at it. To him, it was not a hunt for food. It was something deeper, something darker. It was about power, control, and the thrill of turning the game on those who thought themselves masters of the woods. The younger brother followed, his steps quieter, his breath shallow. There was excitement in him, yes, but also unease. He could feel his heart pounding, not only from the hunt, but from the weight of his brothers while pressing down on him. He wanted to prove himself, to match the older one's cold precision. Yet inside him, the storm raged. A part of him wanted to stop, to turn back, to let the hunters walk free. But another part, the part that had grown sharper under his brother's shadow, crave. The moment they would strike. The hunters stopped to rest in a small clearing. The lanterns set down. Their rifles leaned against stumps and logs. They spoke in low voices, trading small jokes to mask their unease. One man, tall, broad-shouldered, his laugh louder than the rest, took a pull from a flask and passed it along. The fire they started crackled weakly, its light reaching only a few feet before being devoured by the dark. They did not know the brothers were circling them, moving closer with every breath. The first sound came suddenly and sharply, the crack of a twig. Heads turned, rifles lifted, lanterns swayed. Silence pressed harder, but nothing appeared. A few of the men laughed nervously, brushing it off as a deer or raccoon, but their hands tightened around their weapons. The forest felt different now. The trees seemed to lean closer, and the shadows thickened. Then it began. The older brother struck first. From the cover of trees, he let out a whistle, low, eerie, cutting through the night like a blade. The hunters froze, their eyes darting, confusion spreading among them. Then came the blur of motion, a figure darting from shadow to flame. A rifle fired, its echo exploding through the woods, but the shot went wild, striking nothing but bark. Before the men could reset, the younger brother lunged from the opposite side, his knife flashing in the firelight. One hunter fell with a cry, blood spilling fast, and chaos erupted. The clearing turned into madness. Lanterns toppled, fire kicked high into sparks. Rifles cracked in desperate bursts that lit the dark with flashes. The brothers moved through it like wolves, fast, precise, striking before men could steady their aim. The older brother's face was carved from stone, his eyes empty as he swung the butt of a rifle into a man's skull. The younger's breath came in ragged gasps, his knife slick, his hands trembling even as he drove the blade again and again. The hunters screamed, some in pain, some in rage, all in fear. The forest, once silent, now roared with violence. One man broke and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, his shouts tearing through the night. For a moment, the younger brother hesitated, torn between chasing him and finishing the ones still struggling. The older barked a sharp command, and the younger obeyed, plunging his blade into the nearest chest. The man's scream gurgled, then stilled. When it was done, the clearing was littered with bodies. Blood pooled into the dirt, dark and glistening under the weak firelight. The air stank of gunpowder, iron, and smoke. The few lanterns that remained upright flickered, casting trembling light across faces frozen in terror, eyes wide, mouths open in cries that never finished. The forest had its feast. For a long moment, the brothers stood in the aftermath, their breaths heaving, their skin slick with sweat and blood. The older brother's eyes scanned the clearing with satisfaction, his chest rising steady, calm, as if this were not chaos but order to him. The younger, though, trembled. His knife clattered to the ground as his hand shook. His breath came in shallow gulps, his eyes darting from body to body, seeing not just meat, but men he had known, men whose voices had once filled the store, whose children played in the dirt roads of town. His stomach twisted while rising in his throat, but he swallowed it back. He could not show weakness. Not now. The forest pressed its silence again, heavier than before. The cries had ended, but their echoes seemed to linger in the trees, carried on the branches. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The sound eerie in the sudden stillness. The older brother stepped forward, his hand gripping the younger shoulder. His voice was low, steady, almost soothing, but it carried a weight that left no room for refusal. They would cover the traces. The bodies would not be left for the town to find. He spoke of burial, of fire, of ways to make sure the forest swallowed every sign of what had been done. The younger nodded, his mind fogged, his body numb. He bent to the work. Though each touch of flesh made his skin crawl, they dragged bodies to the edge of the clearing, working with the cold precision of men who had done this before. Blood smeared their clothes, their hands. The older moved with a terrifying calm, as if burying men was no different than skinning a deer. The younger's movements were jerky, uneven, his eyes flicking away whenever he caught sight of a familiar face. He wanted to stop, to scream, to confess, but his brother's presence bound him tighter than chains that belie dawn. The clearing was bare. The fire had died to ash, the ground scarred with fresh soil and scattered leaves. No rifles remained, no lanterns, no sign of the men who had walked into the woods the night before. Only silence, deep and suffocating, stretched across the land once more. The brothers walked back to their cabin, their steps heavy. The older brother carried himself tall, his face unreadable, his purpose fulfilled. The younger lagged, his eyes haunted, his body trembling under the weight of what he had done. He knew there was no turning back now. Whatever part of him had once wanted escape was buried in that clearing with the hunters, and the forest, ever watchful, seemed to settle again. It had taken what the brothers gave, and in its silence, it kept their secret, for now. Morning came, but the town did not wake to peace. When the hunters failed to return, their families waited at first with patience, then with worry, then with the kind of fear that settles into the bones. Wives stood on porches staring toward the tree line. Children clutched at skirts. Fathers and brothers gathered in the streets, whispering about what could have gone wrong. They told themselves the men had camped out for the night, that they would walk back into town by noon, rifles over their shoulders, grins wide with stories of the hunt. But noon came and went. By sundown, the waiting had curdled into dread. The forest became an enemy. Groups went searching, calling out names until their throats were raw, their lanterns swaying in the dark. They found nothing. No rifles, no tracks, not even a shred of clothing. The woods had swallowed the men whole. The silence that returned with the search parties told the story better than words could. Mothers wept openly. Children asked questions no one could answer. And the men who had stayed behind carried the weight of failure heavy on their shoulders in the brothers' cabin. The aftermath played out in silence. The older brother worked with the same steadiness as ever, cutting wood, setting traps, skinning hides. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice was calm, as though nothing had changed. But the younger brother could not escape what lived in his mind. Each face returned to him at night, each cry, each drop of blood soaking into the soil. His hand shook when he reached for his knife. His stomach churned at the smell of meat cooking over the fire. He washed his hands until his skin cracked, but the feeling of blood never left. The town's eyes turned sharper toward the brothers. Whispers no longer hid in corners. They followed them openly. Mothers pulled their children closer when the younger brother passed by. Men stopped talking when the older one entered the store. Some wanted to confront them outright, to demand answers, but fear held them back. The brothers carried themselves with too much stillness, too much quiet power. No one dared make the first move. The younger brother felt the weight of those eyes burning into him. Each time he walked through town, guilt clawed at his throat. He avoided the gazes of widows, the pleading looks of children who searched the faces of every man as if hoping their father might still return. At night, he heard voices in his dreams, whispers, cries, footsteps circling him. He woke drenched in sweat, sometimes screaming, only to find his older brother staring at him from across the room, silent, unblinking. The families of the missing men changed. Grief reshaped them, hollowed them. Wives became shadows of themselves, carrying on chores with empty eyes. Sons took up plows too early, trying to fill shoes that would never walk through the door again. Daughters lit candles in church, their prayers trembling into silence. The community, once steady and bound together, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and fear. Some wanted justice, others wanted silence, and all wanted the forest to give back what it had taken. The law came slowly. News traveled beyond the town, carried by letters and whispers, until county men arrived on horseback, asking questions, demanding answers. They pressed the brothers, but the older one's calm was unshakable. He spoke politely, firmly, his story straight and simple. They had not seen the hunters, had not entered the woods that night. The younger stumbled over his words, his voice cracking, but the older smoothed over every falter, every slip, until the lawmen left unsatisfied but unable to act. There was no evidence, no bodies, nothing but fear and whispers. The younger brother's guilt grew heavier with each passing day. He drank more, his hands shaking as he lifted the flask. He drifted from shores, leaving traps unchecked, wood uncut. He lingered by the tree line at night, staring into the shadows as if waiting for something to step out. His mind twisted with regret, but also with a strange, gnawing hunger, the memory of the hunt, the rush of power. It terrified him, how part of him wanted it again, even as the rest of him broke under the weight of it. The older brother, meanwhile, grew colder. Where the younger crumbled, he hardened. He dismissed the stares of the townsfolk, met their whispers with silence. In his mind, the crime had not been wrong. It had been necessary, a demonstration of control, a reminder that the forest was theirs, not the hunters. He carried no guilt, only certainty. And he demanded the same from his brother, lashing out when weakness showed, forcing him deeper into silence and obedience. The town's grief curdled into resentment. Men spoke openly now about the curse of the brothers, about how the land itself seemed poisoned by their presence. The pastor thundered from the pulpit, warning of evil walking in flesh among them, though he never spoke names. Still, everyone knew. People stopped going near the brothers' land. Some families moved away altogether, leaving behind empty cabins and untended fields. And still, no justice came. Without proof, the law could not act. Without bodies, the families could not bury their dead. The absence itself became the wound. Every empty chair at a table, every silence at a church pew, every face missing from the harvest fields kept the grief alive. It was as though the town had been robbed, not just of men, but of its very breath. For the brothers, the aftermath stretched like a shadow. The younger sank deeper into his torment, haunted by what he could not undo. The older stood firm, unmoved, his silence colder than any denial. Their bond, once twisted but unbreakable, began to show cracks. The younger dreamed of confessing, of laying the truth bare, but the older's presence silenced him. Fear and loyalty chained him in place, leaving him trapped between guilt and survival. The crime reshaped more than just the brothers and the families. It reshaped the land itself. Hunters no longer entered the forest with pride. They entered with dread, if at all. The woods that had once fed them now carried the memory of screams, a memory that clung to the trees and seeped into the soil. The town, once steady in its traditions, now lived under a cloud of fear and suspicion. The curse of the brothers was no longer a whisper. It was a truth written in. To every missing face, every sleepless night, every step into the forest that felt like stepping into a grave. And beneath it all, the silence of the woods held steady, as if guarding the secret it had been fed. The brothers walked free, but neither escaped. One carried guilt that hollowed him, the other carried certainty that hardened him, and together they lived in a world that would never forget what the forest had swallowed whole. Years passed, but the shadow of that night in the woods never loosened its grip on Kentucky. The families of the missing men carried their grief like a second skin, one that never peeled away, no matter how many seasons turned. Wives grew older alone, children became adults without fathers to guide them, and homes that once echoed with laughter sat heavy with silence. The town itself changed, too. The woods, once a place of pride, became a place of fear. People avoided the tree-line at dusk, their eyes drifting away as though even looking too long invited danger. The forest lived on, but it no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the memory of what was taken. The brothers lived on as well, though what they carried could hardly be called life. The older brother hardened with every year, his face weathering into something that looked carved from stone. He never wavered, never faltered, never spoke of that night again. To him, it was as though the crime had folded neatly into the rhythm of survival, no different than trapping a fox or butchering a hog. He had convinced himself it was not murder, but order, the natural end of men foolish enough to test the forest. His certainty became his shield, and though the town's whispers grew louder with each year, he met them with silence, unshaken. The younger brother, however, was never the same. His guilt did not fade, it grew heavier. Every face of the men they buried returned to him in dreams, each voice whispering through his ears like the wind through the trees. He drank more, stumbled through town with eyes sunken and skin pale. The children who once ran from him out of fear now avoided him out of pity, whispering that he was broken. Some night, he wept openly, his sobs carrying through the woods, but his older brother never comforted him. He only watched, his silence a command stronger than any spoken word. In the end, the younger brother became a ghost before death even reached him, hollow, cracked, and bound by a loyalty he no longer wanted but could not escape. The law never brought justice. With no bodies, no evidence, no confession, there was nothing to hold on to. Outsiders came now and then, deputies, investigators, even newspapermen hungry for a story. They asked questions, took notes, and left with nothing but fragments of rumor. The town grew used to disappointment, to the ache of unsolved loss. Justice was not served in the way the families hoped for. No trial, no gallows, no official word to mark the end of the men's stories. Instead, justice lived only in whispers, in the silent stares cast at the brothers when they walked into town. It was a justice without weight, without closure. A reminder that some crimes never find a reckoning in courts or laws. The broader wound ran deeper than the families or the brothers. The crime shifted the balance of the community itself. Trust frayed. Men no longer hunted in small groups. They went in large numbers or not at all. The forest economy, once a lifeline, weakened. Fear bled into everything. Into the pews of the church, into the aisles of the store, into the way people raised their children. They taught them not just to be cautious, but to be wary, to keep silence when silence was safest. The crime had not only stolen lives, it had reshaped how people lived with one another, turning neighbors into watchers, friends into skeptics. There was no grand ending for the brothers. No punishment struck from above, no justice delivered clean and sharp. Instead, their lives dwindled into quiet ruin. The younger wasted away, eaten from the inside by guilt, until death finally came and ended his torment. Some said it was a drink, others said it was his own hand, but no one knew for certain. His body was buried on their land, a simple grave marked by nothing more than a stone. The older brother lived on, alone, the cabin falling into rot around him. He aged, grew frail, yet his silence never broke. He carried his secret into the grave, never confessing, never repenting, leaving behind only a shadow darker than the one that had already consumed him. What remained were questions, and they were heavier than answers would have been. Why had the brothers turned on their own kind? Was it madness, hunger, vengeance, or some twisted need for power? The town argued, whispered, speculated, but no clear truth ever surfaced. That was the cruelty of it. The crime lived on not only in grief, but in the uncertainty of human nature. It forced people to reckon with the darkest parts of themselves, to wonder what they might be capable of if pushed far enough into silence, isolation, or rage. The story of the brothers and the missing hunters became legend in time. Parents told it to their children as a warning. Do not stray too far. Do not tempt the forest. Do not trust too easily. Outsiders heard it as a tale of a cursed land, of men who turned into something less than human. But beneath the layers of legend was the truth of human nature, the fragile line between survival and cruelty, between loyalty and possession, between control and madness. In the end, the crime revealed more about people than about the brothers themselves. It showed how fear reshapes a town, how silence protects the guilty as much as it punishes the cynic, and how grief lingers longer than justice ever can. It left behind a community that learned to live with shadows, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself in monstrous form. Sometimes it wears the face of neighbors, brothers, men who walk the same dirt roads and breathe the same air. The forest still stands. Its trees stretch tall, its shadows thick, its silence heavy. People still speak of that night, though fewer now remember the details. But every time the wind moves through the branches, carrying whispers that sound too much like voices, the story breathes again. It is not just a tale of two brothers who turned hunters into supper. It is the tale of how quickly order can slip into chaos, how power can twist love into control, and how justice, when it fails, leaves scars that never fade. And in that way, the brothers never truly died. Their curse lived on in the people, in the soil, in the silence of the woods that will always remember what they tried so hard to bury.